Hi everyone. If what you're seeing on television is driving you absolutely bananas, well then join this conversation for a sane discussion on what's happening with Bollywood, with drug abuse, with drug use, what the difference is between the two, and whether it's time to actually have an honest conversation about marijuana. It's certainly something we need to have because otherwise the headlines are going to be all about one person tomorrow, and her name is Deepika Padukone. You see her there on your screen, looking, of course, very controlled, but actually for the last 2 days, you've had news channels virtually stalking her, chasing her car, and doing the most kind of inane commentary. Lost in all this noise, lost in all of this noise is the larger discussion. The larger discussion is this, that in 2018, 31 million Indians, that's right, just let that number sink in, 31 million Indians were consumers of cannabis, right? Of which 13 million were using weed and hash. Now, we're not here to make a case for drug use, for the consumption of marijuana, for smoking up. But what we are here to ask is whether criminalizing the use of marijuana is actually reducing consumption, or is it actually having the exact opposite impact? That's the conversation before us today. And also we're asking whether the Narcotics Bureau is actually chasing stars instead of the cartels and suppliers behind them. Let me introduce a very distinguished panel on the program today, one by one. We're joined first by Dr. Vikram Patel. Vikram Patel is at Harvard University's Medical School. Welcome, Vikram. We're also joined by Amrish Satwik, a doctor and vascular surgeon at the Gangaram Hospital. Pleasure to have you on. I'm also welcoming to the program Sadhvi Khosla. Sadhvi Khosla made a film on drug use in Punjab, and she's here to talk about what she discovered. And we're also joined by Neha Singhal. Neha Singhal works with the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy and has done extensive research on whether criminalization is actually reducing consumption of drugs, in particular of cannabis. So I will start with you, Vikram, if I may. I know that you have been arguing that we need to take another look at this entire argument around criminalization. Why do you say that? Because, the moment you say that, you'll be accused of actually being an advocate for drug use, right? Even when I shared that I was doing this program on social media, I had a whole bunch of people coming after me saying, you're just trying to save Deepika Padukone. But that is the kind of reductionist level of conversation we're now at, unfortunately, in this country. But go ahead, Vikram.
I look at whether policies work or not. I don't have a value position, although I do with the cannabis, but I would just, for the moment, take an empirical science-based position. Prohibition has never worked anywhere in the world. And that's the bottom line. There's a rich history of trying prohibition in a variety of countries. Every single attempt has failed abysmally. And the main reason it's failed abysmally is because many of these habits are ingrained in our cultural and social fabric and go back millennia. One of the real false ideas is that this is a modern problem. Another really bizarre one in India is that this is an imported, a Western problem. And I think all of these are false ideas, they're false histories. In fact, the use of substances, narcotics, is deeply ingrained in human society from the very beginning of time. And the correct approach to actually control those substances, to minimize harm associated with those substances, is called harm minimization, not prohibition. What prohibition has effectively done is push the entire trade underground, criminalize it, and actually remove the opportunity in which you can create a healthy conversation in society about how you use drugs.
So you're saying that you're not advocating for the use or non-use of weed, but what you are saying is when you ban something, you actually push it underground, right? So Vikram, if I understand your position, you're not for legalizing marijuana, you are for decriminalizing it and regulating it. These are two completely different positions. I mean, there are people who want to legalize it, which means you can walk into a store, as you can in some countries in Europe, in some states of the United States of America, and just, buy your weed. I'm guessing you're not saying that, you're saying it's not a crime. Are these two different things? Would you want to clarify?
Yeah, I mean, the Vidhi Center, I'm sure will be able to give us the nuances on the legal aspect. They are very different things. Decriminalization simply means that you do not do this madness that you're seeing right now. It's an absolute perversity that you describe. And so at least that will stop, and the cops can actually start doing what they should be doing, is actually stopping the mayhem on our roads, the open, blatant breaking of even basic life-saving laws right under their noses on the streets of Delhi and everywhere else, and actually start doing a proper job of law enforcement. So at the very least, that might be a better efficient use of our public resources. So that's decriminalization. But legalization is actually a much bigger task. That is when the state actually permits the sale and distribution of a substance like it permits the sale and distribution of alcohol and tobacco in India, which,
Right.
by the way, it is important to point out, are also narcotic substances because they are also addictive. And so there's a peculiarity here that tobacco and alcohol, which I do not want to call for prohibition, by the way, so don't mistake what I'm saying here. But, we have this rather unusual situation that the two most commonly used drugs of addiction are completely legal, but one that is actually historic and ancient in our society is not.
So you're speaking, in a sense, to the double speak of this all. Now, Dr. Amrish Satvik, that said, there is actually research, and actually somebody, a friend of mine who was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, wrote to me this evening, and she said, please do ask the experts. She's read about how the use of cannabis may actually exacerbate, that is, worsen certain mental health conditions, according to material that she's been exposed to, books that she's read. So I think that we should not underplay the addictive quality of marijuana. We should also not underplay the fact that it's often diluted, where the addictive component, when it is sold by peddlers, is actually increased. So the marijuana that you're actually getting is, in fact, the most toxic, addictive form, at least as one believes one gets it in India.
That's right. I think we start this discussion from the fact that marijuana is perhaps the most commonly used illicit drug anywhere in the world, most commonly consumed illicit drug anywhere in the world. Now, it enjoys this curious reputation of having what's known as, it gladdens the mind. It has a kind of an easy psychoactive effect. And the only thing that I'd like to present here is that it's not a harmless drug.
Yeah.
Now, I don't mean that in a sense that, stray recreational use, infrequent, occasional use is harmful in any great way. But there seems to be a lot of evidence that sustained use, prolonged use, can have lasting complications. And I think perhaps the only thing that I'd like to add to the narrative here is a very curious complication of prolonged use of marijuana, which is never spoken about. And this is called anhedonia. Okay? Now, this is very curious because what this drug does in the long term is that it kind of hijacks the reward center of the brain, all the circuitry that is responsible for the reward center. And therefore, a stimulus or an activity that would be pleasurable or would get you some sort of a rush no longer does that. And not just that, the motivation to seek pleasure from that activity is also deadened and dampened and kind of lost until you take the drug again. So think of something that gives you intense pleasure, like having cheesecake or listening to Begum Akbar or having sex or whatever. Now, think about the inability to experience pleasure unless you take the drug.
Yeah.
What seems to happen is that you then subsequently require progressively higher quantities of the drug to get the same kind of consummatory reward processing, and sometimes cannabis doesn't satisfy, which is why there's an inclination to move on to stronger drugs, which is what the gateway theory is all about. And, I was actually not entirely convinced about this till I started reading up and I saw a couple of reports. And there was this very curious, objective evidence of this. They took a study that involved a bunch of chronic marijuana users and a control group, which was matched for age and gender and other things. And they give these both groups a drug called Ritalin, which promotes the secretion of dopamine, which acts on the reward center of the brain. And in the control group, it produced all the effects, rise in blood pressure and heart rate, and the restlessness, the high, the euphoria. And in the group of marijuana users, who basically people who were smoking 5 joints a day for about 5 times a week for about 5 to 7 years, they experienced none of the objective rise in the parameters and none of the effects, to the extent that the examiners thought that they had to go through the vials to see if the drug injected was past its expiry.
Okay.
And then the thing is that this anhedonia, this inability to experience pleasure, is also a transdiagnostic concept which relates to depression and bipolar disorders and schizophrenia, which is why I think this must be closely examined, and this no longer in the long term is a recreational drug or a soft drug.
So thank you for that. That was very informative. I had no idea. And I want Vikram to respond to that before I open it up for Neha and Sadhvi. Vikram, I think that's the point, right? That we don't know enough. Maybe the gateway drug theory I'd heard, but I didn't know what Amrish has just told us.
This is true of every single substance. If that is the reason, if the abuse of a substance in this extremely rare way, I have to tell you, the prevalence of this kind of, Amrish is exactly right, that chronic heavy use of this substance does produce long-term damage, but it occurs in about 1 in 1,000 cannabis users. And so therefore, in order to actually control or remove the risk of that exquisitely rare kind of complication would be like saying we should ban alcohol completely because about 1 in 1,000 drinkers develop cirrhosis, or we should ban taking sugar because a large number of people who take sugar get diabetes. We should ban Coke, because people who drink Coke have their blood sugar go up. We should ban a million other things that are part of human consumption, because when you consume too much of it, it harms your health. Virtually every single thing that we do in life, if taken to an excess, will have an adverse effect on our physiology. And that is true of so many behaviors. So I think we have to have a sense of moderation here. That is to say, that by actually decriminalizing, what you do is to bring this substance into an open society, and you actually have a possibility, at least, of preventing the sort of harms that Amrish is correctly alluding to.
So I'm going to ask the doctors now to just stand by, and we're going to hear from Neha and Sadhvi, one a filmmaker, the other a lawyer. And Neha, I'm particularly interested in the work that you have done in Sikkim. But before I ask you to talk about that, we have a comment from Rakesh Nair on our live stream, who says we're still struggling with tobacco, alcohol, and pan masala. Now you want to introduce another psychoactive drug. It'll wreak havoc on the population. Now, what your work, just for context for our viewers, showed you in Sikkim was that they started off with the same approach of criminalizing, and they found that consumption actually remained the same, probably increased. Then they decriminalized it, and they found different results. So please tell us what you found.
So, I'm so glad you've asked me about Sikkim, because I think it's such an interesting society, and the governance model and what they have done is such a fantastic model that can be replicated. So in 2006, when they enacted their law, they because NDPS hadn't added, it wasn't in a place where they'd added Proxivon and cough syrups and all of these things, which were their specific problem. So they enacted SADA, and they had exactly the same model as NDPS, except they didn't have imprisonment even then for drug consumption, but everything else was exactly the same. Over time, over amendments, they have come to an amendment, or they have come to a law in 2018 where drug consumption of all drugs is completely decriminalized. So what this was over the years, a lot of ex-addicts had become an association, and they had a lot of NGOs in Sikkim, where they then started showing that how a kinder approach to people can actually help them get better and help others get better. But criminalization made them just run away. So there was this one person that I spoke to who was running from city to city because the police was after him. But the second they started decriminalizing, this person had access to de-addiction centers. So this introducing psychoactive substance into the market is actually a wrong view to take, because they are already introduced. Everybody knows this, marijuana just being one of them. So they're already in the market. What criminalization only does is that it stigmatizes and it reduces access to the addiction centers. What police does in Punjab, and I'm sure Sadhvi can probably cooperate in this, is then when they have these drug, or when they have arrest rates to match, when they have to come to a certain quota that they have to do by the end of the month, they'll just wait wait outside a de-addiction center. So they'll just arrest people in hordes because they know people who are going to de-addiction centers are addicts and they have committed an offense under the NDPS Act. So they'll arrest them, they'll get their arrest numbers, and then they'll do whatever they want with them. In Sikkim, under the law, they're no longer allowed to do that. And that has had like a kinder effect on society generally. Police is kinder, the courts are kinder. So it's that.
Okay, so I want to take this to Sadhvi, if I may. Sadhvi, here's the question. You spent a long time looking at drug abuse in Punjab. Would you recommend decriminalization, or would you have the concerns that Dr. Amrish Sathwik just expressed? Again, I want to say that when we talk about decriminalization, it's not the same as advocating the use of marijuana, the use of cannabis. It is about saying what's the best approach to not get people addicted.
Okay, Barkha, first of all, thank you so much for doing this much required debate. It was very important. See, I think there is a growing movement in the West to legalize cannabis and marijuana. And unfortunately, we Indians like to blindly ape the West. So what West does today, India does tomorrow. Okay, so that has been our obsession with the West. But I urge India to carefully weigh the risks and benefits before following the West. First of all, it's a myth that if cannabis and marijuana is legalized and regularized, the harms can be minimized. No, it won't be. With legalization, we need to understand comes commercialization. And this comes at a cost which we have seen with tobacco and alcohol over the last century. India is already struggling with addictives like alcohol and tobacco. We are not in a position to legalize drugs in India. We need to understand what worked for Portugal, what worked for Mexico will not work for India. Indian society is very different. You know, the moment you legalize, there will be unintentional use of drugs by children at home. I have a teenager at home. I don't want drugs to get legalized, and tomorrow I know that my son is having a free run with drugs. So who is going to take responsibility of that? I have, since my campaign against drug abuse in Punjab, I have been very vocal about one thing, that what India needs is social awareness. What India needs is, we need to tackle this problem as a moral problem. Okay, we need a very strong anti-drug policy, something which we do not have, and the policy which we have, I mean, it's just on the paper.
So Sadhvi, just 1 second. I want to understand what you're saying. You're saying that the moment you decriminalize something, you allow it to scale, you allow its commercialization, and that's what you worry about. That
Absolutely.
It will become a business. It will become a business like tobacco and alcohol. I think that's what you're actually saying, right, Sadhvi?
See, yeah, Barkha, yes, absolutely right. Now, tell me one thing: West America has guns and gambling legalized. So tomorrow, people here will say, the ones who are championing for legalizing the drugs, tomorrow they will say, let's legalize guns also, let's legalize gambling also, because they need to travel all the way to Vegas and Macau to do gambling. So are we going to legalize gambling tomorrow? We need to see what will work for Indian society. Legalization of drugs will not work for Indian society at all.
Okay. Let me
do that. You are going to open a business. Yes. Yeah.
Let me take this to Vikram. Dr. Vikram Patel, I think, there can be two views on, what the law should be on gambling. And again, I want to say we should not use the words legalizing and decriminalizing interchangeably. We're mixing them up. One is open access to something. The other is to not throw someone in jail for it, right? So I think we need to distinguish, though, of course, a lawyer would better explain to us what the differences is. So maybe Neha can come in on that later. But, I want to take a question that I just saw from somebody on the screen, Shreya. And this also is dangerous. Shreya says, I agree with Vikram. Sugar can also be called a drug. Why don't we ban fizzy substances? They're a lot more harmful than cannabis. So there's kind of romance around smoking pot, from the days of Zinat Taman to now. Is that dangerous? I'm all for romancing around Zinat Taman.
Yeah, Barkha,
cultural
Zeenat Aman was
subculture.
definitely influenced by the 1960s, but it's a very
Yeah.
peculiar comment that India adopted the West. Actually, India has never criminalized cannabis until 1985. It was, in fact, when we adopted the criminalization, we were following Western philosophy. That's very interesting to hear Sadhvi's comment there. It's exactly the opposite. Actually, India was a historically non-criminalizing society for cannabis. It was in 1985 when India was facing bankruptcy. It needed a loan from the International Monetary Fund to actually go through what was, in fact, a black hole in our finances, that the US insisted that the only conditions under which we will get a loan is to sign a regressive policy on drugs. So completely opposite to what Sadhvi said. It is the criminalization which is a foreign policy. And what's very peculiar, of course, is that it's interesting how we suddenly, in our exceptional ways, say India is a very exceptional place, etc. And we say, for example, homosexuality. Oh, it was never part of our society. We are not going to adopt Western values. Actually, it's a British law. And it's so curious, how we do. We sort of we get these laws from the West, we make them ours. And when the West figures out that actually these are pointless laws, they're regressive laws, they're discriminatory laws, we suddenly say, this is our culture. But actually, this was never our culture.
But can you speak to this equivalence that is being drawn by those who advocate for marijuana use with sugar, with coke, with,
Look, I think they're different. I'm not advocating for marijuana use. Let's be very clear. Okay, under no circumstances do I advocate for marijuana use, nor do I advocate for people to drink Coca-Cola and Thumbs Up. Okay, because they're both pretty damaging to your health. But I would not call for putting people who drink Coca-Cola in prison. And I would certainly try and make sure that when Coca-Cola is sold, and if marijuana is sold, that it is taxed appropriately, so there's a disincentive to use it in the same way that we tax alcohol, that there are all the regulations on the sale. For example, underage people, Sadhvi's right, we do not want adolescents smoking marijuana. We don't want them drinking Coke either, by the way. But we need to therefore have very strict regulations on their sale, on their distribution. And I'll tell you what, the issue of commercialization she raises is absolutely a concern. And I do agree that there is, if we ever do go down that route, it is extremely important that it is not a commercial business, because that is where the US has gone. And I do believe it's the wrong tactic. But there are other countries, like, for example, Canada, in which the state has completely controlled the sale and distribution. In other words, you cannot have commercial interests and marketing in the way alcohol in this country is done, which I think is harmful, and I think it should be controlled.
Okay, so I'm glad we're kind of agreeing that commercialization of marijuana is not what anyone is advocating. Amrish, I want to bring you in. There's a comment on our screen which says this debate is all about keeping the interest of the rich in mind and in turn forgetting its harmful effects to the society at large. And India, what about the poor and the underprivileged, right? Now, here's the point. We know that the law will punish perhaps many more poor people, people who live on the margins, children on the street. That said, there is a sense of privilege, elite, glamour when it comes to the film industry. And perhaps one of the reasons that people are reacting in the angry way that they are is because it seems a kind of entitlement. This is not someone taking marijuana but for medical purposes. This is like the rich and the famous partying it up. And there seems to be some sort of societal revulsion against that, which is why having this conversation right now is so difficult.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, there is a sort of cultural capital or a subcultural capital that is associated with consumption of marijuana. But, I'd like to just restate my case. And I'm not, I'm in fact in complete agreement with Professor Patel in all that he says. And I'm not in favor of prohibition. And in fact, I'm not in favor of any kind of state coercion. All I was doing was giving you an executive summary on the physiological effects of consumption of marijuana, because this is not a part of the narrative. People should know what they're getting into. They should know that this is a recreational drug that has something inside it that fundamentally precludes the exercise of moderation. That's why it's different from the others. And, which is why it could lead to other things. That is all I was doing. I think, you're right. The manner in which this is being played out is a sort of comeuppance of the rich. And in fact, what you're seeing on the television is the greatest advertising campaign for marijuana right now. Because here you have, all the time this playing across your screens, and people who have no idea what this is about, will want to find out what the fuss is about. Let me just try this out. This is ridiculous. This is like an advertising campaign.
Yeah, but Amrish, can I ask you and the panel to react to the fact that all of this started, of course, with the tragic death of Sushant Singh Rajput, right? Widely initially reported as a suicide, now being probed. Now, what we do know from the statements of the Mumbai police is that he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and we also know that his partner, Rhea Chakraborty, did procure marijuana or some drug that she thought would help him feel better. Now, here's where I feel a little worried, because if someone already has a mental health problem, there's so much alternative culture, sort of material also on how marijuana makes everything good. If someone is mentally ill, he may have thought it would make him feel better.
That's right.
So maybe I'll go here.
Yeah,
Barkha,
Vikram.
I think
you wanted to come in? Yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is a concern. I would certainly say that there is reasonably good evidence that for people who are vulnerable for serious mental illness, that marijuana can be harmful. There's no question about that. Particularly the more hybrid, toxic varieties of marijuana, which thankfully, at least in India, that is not the average marijuana that is sold here. That's the other important thing to distinguish, that marijuana comes in very many different degrees of strength. The Indian marijuana is one of the weakest in the world, and the ones you get in the West are all hybrid. They're grown in labs and so on. So I do feel sad that the issue of this young actor's use of marijuana has been converted into blaming him as if he's a drug addict and therefore somehow he deserved to actually have this end. That's a horrific reading of the story. Because you're quite right to point out many people with mental health problems use marijuana in a desperate way to control.
But should they be? I think my worry is.
Well, ideally not, Barkha. Ideally not. If we
Yeah.
had a better quality mental health care system, perhaps they might not. But the quality of our mental health care system is very short. So I do think that's important to recognize. People use marijuana to calm troubled minds, and it's not always good. Let me just say one more thing. I have a friend who has cancer. She uses marijuana to help control the pain of her cancer. So medical marijuana has now become pretty much part of mainstream medicine in the world. So it's also important to remember marijuana can be used for therapeutic purposes, but I would obviously say not for serious mental illness.
Now, here's the point. Medical marijuana is not legal in India, Neha, right?
Barkha, it is legal.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you explain to us what the law is on medical marijuana? I actually didn't know that.
So Section 8, which prohibits all drugs under the NDPS Act, basically has an exception clause which says except for medicinal and scientific purposes. So that exception clause makes marijuana available for medicinal purposes. We don't use it, but it is there.
I'm just wondering how often doctors actually prescribe marijuana for medical purposes.
They don't.
Amrish, anyone? Vikram?
Yeah.
Amrish?
Yeah,
Amrish?
so I mean, it has interesting properties as regards being an antiemetic, which suppresses nausea and vomiting. It induces appetite, so that's the other use. Pain, of course, it's a substitute for the opioids, so and quite effective. But it's not a very commonly used, preparation for either pain relief or for nausea, vomiting, or the other effects.
Okay, so I want to go back to Neha on the difference between decriminalizing and legalizing, because everybody in the comment stream is using this interchangeably. And then I'll come to you, Sadhvi. I know you had something to say. Neha, go ahead.
I think Vikram covered it. It's just decriminalizing is where you no longer make consumption of cannabis or, in my opinion, any drug a criminal offense, where you don't throw somebody in jail and you don't prosecute them. Legalizing is creating a whole framework where it is now legally available to be purchased, to be distributed in the market. So that's just it, actually. These are the two very fundamental differences between the two things, between legalization and decriminalization.
So, Sadhvi, would you have a problem with decriminalizing as opposed to legalizing? And if you would, tell us why.
Okay, Barkha. First of all, it's important to make a distinction between legalization, decriminalization, and commercialization. While legalization and decriminalization are used in a legal context, but commercialization is what I'm worried about, because that's a business side of things. And here I would like to, state, especially America's example, because the goal of commercialization of business is to sell a product. And we all know that in America, cannabis industry is growing very, very steadily. So my worry is only on the business side of it. And here, Dr. Vikram Patel would know better, but I want to tell you about one research which I came across on Colorado. Now, Colorado
Yeah.
legalized marijuana about 6-7 years ago. And then
Okay.
they formed a panel to study the effect of decriminalization and legalization of marijuana. Now, what their panel found. So I want to let everyone know that this is the findings of the panel. After decriminalization and legalization, they found that it increased unintentional, which I stated earlier, use by children at home. They found that fetus born to mothers who use marijuana seriously harmed. They found that organized crime cases almost tripled in 5 years. They also found that post-legalization, new types of crimes emerged. The number of calls to poison control center mentioning home marijuana exposure increased like anything. So,
Okay.
so this is what worries me. Yeah.
So here's what I just want to, there's a very interesting comment, and Vikram, you can respond to what Sadhvi said. If cannabis should not be made legal, there's a bigger case to outlaw tobacco and alcohol consumption as well. And the reason I bring this up, I do not know about this Colorado report, but I do know that as a feminist, one of the questions that really troubles me is when there is a clear linkage between alcoholic men and domestic violence. It doesn't mean that that's the only reason men beat women, but there is data that shows that. Yet, should that make me an advocate of prohibition? I think I would say no. Yet so many women's groups, Vikram, I know, do advocate it, given what we see happening with women in this country. So I think that's the confusion. Vikram, if you want to come in on, I don't know this Colorado report, but largely, is there research that shows us that legalization can actually lead to enhanced criminal behavior, like Sadhvi is alluding to?
So, one thing that I totally agree with Sadhvi is the idea of commercialization. And the US has gone that route. And I can tell you, I don't agree with that. I absolutely don't agree with that. I do think if you look at the history of the tobacco industry, and given how the tobacco industry for 100 years tried to hide the evidence about the toxic and dangerous nature of tobacco and how it contaminated politics at the highest level, the same thing is going to happen with the cannabis industry. And, Sadhvi is exactly right. And so I am absolutely clear that commercialization of cannabis, giving it to the private sector, is the worst policy decision of all. Yes. It definitely does open the doors for also very toxic varieties of cannabis being sold. And she's also right. There are many health consequences of that as well. And I'm already seeing that in the Harvard hospitals. A lot of my colleagues in accident emergency are already describing an increase in number of young people coming with acute psychotic episode. But you do not see that with cannabis grown on the hillsides of India. This is like comparing beer with absinthe. Even within alcohol, there is 100% alcohol that will kill you the moment you have a little bit, and there's beer that at the most will make you go to the bathroom a lot. So I think one has to recognize that this word cannabis captures a very wide range of products with very different kinds of effects. And I think we have to have a measured conversation about which of these are relatively safe. Nothing is absolutely safe, let's be clear, but it's a relative safety that we're really going for, and which one we should absolutely prohibit. And commercial sale is out of the question. One more thing I want to say, and then hand it back to you, is that actually there are also many countries where decriminalization has occurred and there's been no increase in crime. And the best examples are Portugal and the Netherlands. And maybe those are different contexts. But, since we brought up Colorado, we should also look at the counterfactual. Many other countries have done it, and there's been no increase in crime.
So Barkha, Neha, go ahead. And then I want to come to Ambrish. Neha, go ahead.
So I wanted to make 2 points to what you also said, where would you advocate for prohibition just because alcohol does contribute to domestic violence? I have been studying data on the prohibition acts across the country. And after Bihar prohibited alcohol, what I have seen in domestic violence numbers is that they're reporting no domestic violence cases at all. The domestic violence cases seem to have dropped like some 80-90%. Now imagine that's not possible. What they are doing is probably just not registering domestic violence cases anymore. Now, this is a huge problem. When you make law or criminalizing something or prohibiting something, your agent of change, what that is going to do on the ground is that the police will either arrest the marginalized and shoot up numbers to say, look, we are being deterrent and we are being harsh on crime, or when it's supposed to have a positive effect on society, they're just going to stop arresting people or registering cases completely. So we need to be very careful about using law as an agent of change, and this is something I feel very strongly about. So I needed to just put that put that word in.
No, I'm so glad you've said it, because I'm totally against prohibition, actually, of alcohol, right? But what do you say? Because one knows any number of women who say, my partners get drunk and then they raise their hands. Amrish, I'll come back to you. Just let me go to Sadhvi and Amrish. Amrish, we forget that we only actually outlawed cannabis in 1985, 85, right? In 1985. There are a lot of questions on my stream about bhang, about the Kumbh Mela, about how actually some part of the marijuana plant has been part of India's subculture. So when Sadhvi says we can't ape the West, people are reminding us of that. Though, of course, it needs to be said, I'm no expert, but bhang is a different part. It's not supposed to be the addictive part, right? Neha, am I right? I've never smoked a joint, as you can clearly tell, or had bhang. So, but really, I have no idea. But what I've read is that it's not the addictive part of the plant. Neha, am I right? Stop laughing at me like a good millennial laughing at an older person. But yeah, you want to clarify that for our viewers?
It's supposed to have higher CBD content, and I'm sure the doctors would be able to say this better. But the reason why it's not criminalized is not because it's less addictive. It's because in the parliament in 1985, the parliamentarians were up in arms against criminalizing cannabis. So this was like some little thing that they had come to, where they're like, okay, fine, we will not criminalize bhang because it's such a Shiv Bhakt whatever thing. So it's got nothing to do with the addictive properties of it at all.
Okay, so I just want Amrish to come in on this, because there are all sorts of dilemmas here, right? It is widely believed that in a country that hasn't banned cigarettes, which have to be as fatal to health, right, as marijuana could possibly be, there's a hypocrisy at the core of this. Now, how do we reconcile these competing lobbies? Because there are lobbies. Sadhvi is right about that it isn't that there isn't money behind, commercial money that could push the legalization of marijuana. We saw what happened, for example, with vaping. Right, with vaping in the United States of America, where then they had to crack down on vapes, where initially it was suggested that it was a sort of healthier alternative to smoking cigarettes.
Curiously, you mentioned vaping, and in fact, that was also targeted as a gateway to smoking.
Yeah.
But that is factually incorrect. If at all it is a gate, it's the gate out rather than the gate in. People who are quitting tend to take that gate and not the other way around. But I think, it's a different category of substances that we're comparing here. I think it will serve us well to understand that we are talking about a recreational drug that is psychoactive. And I think people should be aware of the effects, both short-term and long-term, before they get into it. That is my only position. I think, legislation and policy on these matters is, as they say, beyond my pay grade. I wouldn't want to comment on it. And we have more important worthies who might want to comment on that. But certainly, I think people should know what they're getting into.
So as a doctor, what would you tell to someone who sought medical advice from you? How harmful is this for me, doctor? What would you say?
I tend not to pervert matters of physiology with matters of morality. And in that sense, I would completely disagree with Ms. Khosla, because I don't bring morality into this. And it's not my job to rescue people from the consequences of their vices.
Yeah. Yeah, fair enough.
I would say, for stray use and for infrequent use, it isn't particularly harmful. But the fact is that the reputation that it has of, the cannabis strip being this rich array of things, and, it unlocks a certain potential inside you, and the cultural capital on account of it for creative people that takes you to a creative summit, can be very harmful, because then that will get you onto the substance. And you should just know what you're getting into, is all I'm trying to say.
I think that's very important because, if there is a kind of moral trope on one side, there is an over-romanticized trope on the other side. And when people talk about being stray users, it's like those people who say, I only smoke socially. Like, I don't actually know what that means, right? Because these are all very, very intoxicating chemical substances, and we just have to recognize that. Vikram, before I come to you, Sadhvi, I know you've been waiting, so go ahead. Sadhvi, you wanted to make a point. I'm kind of interested in letting our audience know what you found in Punjab. What did you find in Punjab among drug users? What was the profile? Who were the people who were consuming most amount of cannabis? What was it doing to their lives? I think that's important to know. Sadhvi?
Yeah, Barkha. See, nothing much has changed, as you know, in Punjab. The only thing what has changed is governments have changed. Otherwise, life is as usual. Drugs are available as they were available in the previous regime. So as of today, I'm not going by the media circus around this Bollywood and all that, but as of today, there are more than 3 million active drug addict cases in Punjab. I'm not sure when Narcotics Bureau will move to Punjab to catch hold the drug cartel. I don't want to get into that debate, but in Punjab, what I found that the profile of a drug addict is from age 11 and can go up to 50, 55, 60, but mostly from age 11 to 35. That's what I found. 4 years ago, when I conducted the study, though, that time I found that even 30% among the drug addicts, close to 30%, even women are addicts in Punjab. Drugs, mostly synthetic drugs, which are available on the counter. Now, coming to the police part of it, what's most disturbing in Punjab, I don't know about the other states, but what's most disturbing in Punjab, that the safest place to get drugs in Punjab is inside the jail. Inside the jail, the safest place to get drugs. More than 50% of prisoners inside Punjab jail are drug addicts. Colleges, schools, everywhere. And there's an acute, what government needs to focus, that's what I mentioned about anti-drug policy. What government really needs to focus is on rehabilitation programs, sensitizing the society, sensitizing the schools and colleges, and maybe starting skill development programs, especially for the former addicts, to bring the youth back from the oblivion. Yes.
So Sadhvi, I think, and I want to take this to Vikram, I think the debate is exactly that. It gives me goosebumps when I think of 11-year-old kids, smoking up. But when we think about it, we've all seen these kids on the streets of my city, Delhi, right? Who have consumed crack, for example, and we've seen these kids, the police round them up, the police beat them up sometimes. I think the dilemma here is what would reduce consumption levels? Would it be the criminalization that exists, or would it be the decriminalization? But Vikram, there are so many strong opinions on this. And before I come to you, Neha, there's a quick clarification on Sikkim. Someone has written saying Sikkim consumption is still criminalized. There's a penalty. I think what you want to say is there's a penalty but no jail. Is that correct?
No, because cannabis is covered by NDPS, Sikkim couldn't legislate on NDPS. Couldn't legislate on cannabis. Sikkim had its own drugs that it has legislated on, which is a state law. Under that state law, and all the drugs that fall within that state law are decriminalized. But because NDPS doesn't, and NDPS applies to the entire country, cannabis continues to be criminalized under NDPS and not SADA, not their own law.
Okay, I just want to read out to Vikram this very long message because it's at the other end of what we've been discussing. Karan Talwar, cannabis, decriminalize it, sell it, tax it, earn a ton of GST. Put that money back into the school and health system. We'll be the most powerful economy in the world. Cannabis has medicinal, recreational, spiritual, artistic, and economic value. At least remove it from the NDPC Act. Whoever wants to use it will use it anyway. So, this is at the other end of the spectrum. So I just want you to react to that.
Karan, I hope you don't have the cops knocking on your door anytime soon, because I'm sure they're watching this program like they're watching all of us and seeing what we're saying. And but anyway, listen, I want to turn back to the point Sadhvi made, and I think she's right. I think our relationship with drugs has to move to a health model. across the world, people have recognized that when people use substances unhealthily, this is because of an addiction. Addiction is a health problem. And rather than criminalize people who have a health, would you criminalize people who have, let's say, for example, TB? No, you wouldn't. So I think we really have to have a mature and a progressive and a medically sound way of dealing with addictions. All the things she described, for example, health education for young people, controlling the distribution by having taxes, having harm minimization services. This is all part of a public health approach to substances, and I would strongly advocate for that kind of approach. Now, unfortunately, I'm going to have to sign off, Barkha, but it's been terrific to have this conversation, and I look forward to hearing more, hopefully, on the recording that I'm sure you're going to put up. Thank you all very much.
Bye, Vikram. And I'm going to request the others to just stay with us because we have about 15 minutes left and there are lots of questions that are actually coming in. So, Amrish, I'm going to actually take some of these questions to you. There's a question on the screen that says kids also smoke tobacco, i.e. we haven't banned tobacco. So when we talk about kids and drug use, I think what people who advocate decriminalization are really talking about is the kind of hypocrisy in the comparison between the tobacco lobbies and marijuana on the other end.
No, I think there is a distinction to be made because this is a substance that has the potential of stupefying you. It has the potential of attacking and diminishing your faculties. It's not the same thing as tobacco. I mean, in the long term. So it's completely different. And particularly in adolescents, if they're using the substance, it could lead to severe forms of anhedonia and other complications. So, particularly with sustained use. So, I don't think you should equate this with other substances. This is a unique category, cannabis, of recreational.
Would you therefore say that it is more injurious than nicotine, or would you say we don't fully comprehend what it does to the brain?
No, we don't fully comprehend what it does to the brain. But what I'm not trying to make a case for prohibition. All I'm trying to say is that people, a lot of people have come to me and said that we have a kind of policy in this country where fundamentally you have a Narcotics Bureau, but they're looking in the other direction as regards personal consumption, personal use, and they ask, how many convictions have you had? For personal consumption of marijuana, for instance. But the problem is that this is not the argument to be raised because it gives discretionary power to the investigating authorities, as opposed to decriminalization, where you cannot put anyone in prison for consumption, for personal consumption. But the curious conundrum there is that for societies and jurisdictions that have decriminalized marijuana, you have a situation where personal consumption is not prohibited, but sale of the drug is prohibited. So where do you get it from? And sale and trafficking is still a punishable offense. But I think fundamentally you should evolve a situation where any kind of penalty, if at all, and this is not necessarily a criminal penalty that I'm talking about, the fundamental point of a penalty is to act as a deterrent. It is not to punish. You have to arrive at a situation by whatever means that you don't have indiscriminate use of the substance, particularly amongst the young, because that is going to be really damaging.
So I want to ask you, Neha, to tell us a little more about Sikkim, right? Because you have held it up as a success story. What actually happened there?
So I have to put a disclaimer before I say anything that Sikkim is a very small society. We have to consider that. And the interactions between various organs of government and various, the judiciary and the NGOs and the police, and the legislature, they're all very much in sync in that state. So when the addiction groups or when these NGOs started coming together and creating this campaign about decriminalization and saying that criminalization doesn't work, it just pushes use underground, it stigmatizes people, and it doesn't allow them to re-enter society. So when this happened, judges were willing to listen. The legal services authority in that state is very active. They listened. They got the High Court involved. They got the Chief Minister involved. They got the Health Minister involved. And they were all listening to each other. And the police, what is really nice about that state is that the police takes pride in how the number of people that they've arrested. So the central police station in Gangtok had arrested 6 people that year for drug cases. And this is something that they're proud about. The prison, the system, the correctional services is involved in this whole treating people, and they had about 66 people, convicts and under trials together. And the jail authorities were also concerned about the 66 number. They're like, that's just too many. We shouldn't have that many either. So it's like they have flipped the idea of deterrence on its head. They just don't believe in it as a society. So I think Sikkim is more a story of how beautiful that society is and how that has sort of led into the law rather than the law leading into society.
So let me contrast that, Sadhvi, then with Punjab, right? Which is where your work has been. And I think Neha's disclaimer is well taken, that maybe these kind of experiments work in small, interconnected, more controllable societies. Punjab, firstly, as a people, being a Punjabi, I can tell you, we are tough to regulate. Really. No, I'm actually making a serious point. There are cultural things that you actually have to deal with, right? Sadhvi, when you talk about the 11-year-old child, when you talk about people in jail, I think that's the conversation we should be having. Instead, all we're seeing is car chases of, 5 women from the film industry. I'm particularly struck by the fact that if Sushant Singh Rajput consumed drugs, we have to infantilize, his choices. The woman made him do it. If the women do it, they're perpetrators. Where are all the male drug consumers of this industry? I don't know. But what do you make of this entire noise around Bollywood? Is it going to help us have this conversation about the 11-year-old kid who's an addict, or is it going to have the exact opposite impact?
Barkha, you are an eminent journalist of this country. I want to ask you one thing. Leave these last 2 months because of unfortunate and tragic death of Sushant, and this whole genie is out now on Bollywood, drugs and all that. Since last 4 years, since Punjab elected the government, the Captain Amrinder Singh government, when did you hear about Punjab drugs? After 2017, national media thought that Punjab is back to one prosperous state, drugs gone. Captain Amrinder Singh took a vow, keeping gutka, that Guru Granth Sahib in his hand, that in 30 days I will eradicate drugs from Punjab. Did anyone from national media question Captain Amrinder Singh that 30 days are over now? Almost 1,200 days are over since his governance. What has happened? Nothing has changed in Punjab. The only thing is government has changed. The same police nexus, the same political nexus which was operating since last 10 years is operating now. I also want to question our BJP government on one thing, that they promised that our borders will be sealed. Now, from where are we getting drugs? Drugs are coming from Punjab-Afghanistan border. Drugs are coming via Kashmir, again Pakistan border. Drugs are coming via Nepal. What have they done? Our borders are porous.
So here's my point. I mean, in terms of media failings, there are too many in my profession to count. I'm going to have to do a mea culpa moment there on a range of issues. But the point is something else. The point is either this story on these film stars should help us tackle drug use and drug addiction. Otherwise, it's just a
witch hunt.
Or reality TV. Or reality TV as entertainment. Okay, we have about 5-6 minutes left.
One last point, Barkha. I honestly speaking, don't take me wrong, but I do not give a damn to Bollywood. It's an entertainment industry. I don't care about them. They're rich. They can afford drugs. Let them do. I worry about those children. I worry about those Amjad society who cannot afford drugs, but they sell their houses. They sell jewelry. They steal jewelry of their mothers. They buy drugs. They ruin their lives. I am worried about them. Media should be doing stories on them and not be obsessed with the Bollywood.
I think that's a fair point, but unfortunately, when we blame the media, we have to also look at ourselves as an audience. I say this all the time. If you're going to lap up content on film stars and not watch the story of that 11-year-old child, I'm not saying that absolves journalists like myself, but it also, the audience needs to reflect on the kind of media it wants, we want. Amrish, I have a question for you, which is an interesting question on steroids. About how abusing steroids is equally harmful to mental health. So why do we not talk about steroids? Why don't we not talk about the abuse of prescription drugs, which, as we all know, if we know our neighborhood chemists, are simply available over the counter without any prescription?
No, steroids, because they're not recreational drugs.
Yeah.
And as regards the others, yes, I think we should be speaking about this. But the trouble is that I think any discussion on this will involve a coercive form of paternalism as regards society, as regards the role of the state. And I think when you speak about whatever Ms. Khosla is saying, that's a category error, because these are other kinds of drugs that are being discussed. I don't think the menace in Punjab is on account of cannabis preparations. It's largely on account of the more serious forms of drug consumption and addiction that is to be discussed. So I don't think we should confuse the two. But I think messaging is important, education is important. You should eliminate all kinds of information asymmetry about complications and consequences of drug consumption. And I think that's the best way forward. I don't think prohibition is going to achieve anything. I completely agree with Professor Patel when he says that prohibition just drives the thing underground, and there's a flourishing market underground.
So there's a question here, Neha, from Shreya, who says that focus on creating dialogue in schools and colleges about drug use and rehab, counsel people, stop stigmatizing it. Now, this is, of course, sensible advice. But what's also happening is that people are conflating all kinds of things. So, for example, Deepika Padukone is going to be interrogated for her use of hash. Suddenly, people are now linking this to her depression. Some people are saying, oh, this means she wasn't depressed. Some people are saying this is what caused her depression. So we're simultaneously unpacking decades of important and good work that mental health practitioners have done. So I want to ask all of you, if somebody you loved or cared about was smoking weed, what would you say to them? Let's make it personal. Let's make it personal, because otherwise, ये सब theory है.
Actually, more than what would I do if somebody I loved is smoking weed? Everybody, actually, I shouldn't say that on television anyway.
You're going to say everybody you know. No, 1 minute. It's important you should say it, because you were going to say everybody you know is doing it. And the police has been saying that it's become extremely common. Now, is that something that should worry us? Because just it being common, is that the basis for your wanting to decriminalize it? The fact that
absolutely
it's common is important.
Absolutely not. What Amrish has been saying about the effect of marijuana through this entire conversation is that we don't even know. Nobody who's using it knows, because all we know is drugs, crime. That's all that we know. We never actually have a conversation of why it's harmful to you. All that they say is, if you do it, you'll be sent to jail. And that is a problem. When you make an issue a crime, anything a crime, which is, you also brought up paternalism, is that you have now used state sanctions, your criminal sanctions, to tell a person what he or she can or cannot do. And that's an issue.
But how else do you outlaw something? I mean, how else do you outlaw something, right? You would use the state. I mean, I just want to get in on this point of state paternalism. I normally don't like any overarching pass to the state, but for argument's sake, suppose you want to ban cocaine and heroin, which I assume we all agree on. Would that not also be a paternalism, Amrish? I mean, this word that you're using, paternalism?
Yes, it would.
Yes, it would. And but therefore, we must decide on substances that have an immediate capacity to cause harm. And whether, as I said, the worst thing that can be said about marijuana, and I repeat myself, there's something about the drug that precludes the exercise of moderation, which is why it makes, for easy addiction. Okay, you cannot control yourself. And to come back to your question, what if someone that I loved was using the substance? I'll say, look, don't make it a habit, but the drug has the potential of giving you a habit. So be very careful what you're getting.
Yeah, and would you basically say that this is a highly addictive substance?
It is an addictive substance, but we don't have a lot of data in India, but when we do have data on use of marijuana from in various jurisdictions, you will get information which will tell you that almost 80% of the marijuana consumed is consumed by about 25% of the consumers. What that means is that people who are consuming large quantities and repeating this over and over again for a long time. It's not the stray consumers that are largely consuming this. So, which is why this is a substance that has a potential for addiction. You must be.
So just literally a minute left. Sadhvi, to you. A viewer says that I think ganja consumption should be decriminalized, but with the penalty of a lakh if proven in a court of law. That is my conclusion. Will that work, especially among poor people? That's, you see, it's a complex conversation.
My concluding remark is, Barkha, once this genie is out, we cannot put it back into the bottle. Let's be very clear. Once we legalize it, once we decriminalize it, there is no way that we can go back. So we must see the pros and cons. That's very important.
Yeah. Neha, sorry, it's back to you since you've done the work on the decriminalization. Outside of Sikkim, do you have any data about how other states have responded? Even Bhang, please correct me, but does the law on Bhang vary from state to state?
The regulation on bhang varies from state to state. It is still not it's still not criminal to have bhang, but what extent, whether you're allowed to sell it, that varies from state to state. The decriminalization thing that because again, such a passion project for me is so because I did work on Punjab a few years ago and did an extensive data analysis of Punjab court cases in Punjab and who they're arresting, who they're sending to jail. It's always consumers, even though the law is meant to be for traffickers, and the law itself says that addicts and consumers are victims who need to be taken care of by the addiction facilities. It's still always the consumers who are arrested. In Bombay, it's always, and I mean always, 99.9% people who are being arrested are consumers, and most of them are cannabis consumers. And when you say fine for that much, what is happening is that people are sent into the system, they are arrested, they are brought before a judicial authority, and they're convicted, and all of this takes about half a day. So let's also be very, very clear on how our system, our criminal justice system works.
Okay, I have to close, but I think you gave a very important sort of data point in the end, that it's always consumers who are arrested, and even go after all the big stars. We're not here as their advocates or their spokespeople, but if you're going to end your trail there and not get to the cartels, not get to the peddlers, not get to the suppliers, then you aren't changing anything anyway. You're not getting to the root of the problem. The point is that we need to have this conversation. We need to have conversations without judgment, without polarization, without inanities. We've made a start. We've tried. We'll keep an eye on the story. Somehow, I have a feeling, despite the fact that thousands of farmers were marching across the country, the story isn't going anywhere. But for viewers of this channel, P. Sainath will be on our live stream at 8 p.m. to talk about why farmers are protesting. In the meantime, Amrish, Sadhvi, Neha, and Vikram, thank you so much. Thank you to our audience. See you now.
Thank you.
Thank you for having.
Thank you. Bye-bye.